Welcome to the Country Watch Political Intelligence Briefing Quick Hits, a weekly briefing of hot stories across the world in brief. I'm Denise Youngblood-Coleman, the Editor-in-Chief and Senior International Affairs Analyst at Country Watch. This week, the featured country is the United States, where President Joe Biden's domestic Build Back Better agenda and bipartisan infrastructure packages have been on the line. To recap, there were two bills to be passed. There was the $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure deal that had already passed the Senate with the support of every Democrat and 19 Republicans. That bill included $550 billion in new funding for roads, public transport, rural broadband, and other infrastructure. Following urgent intra-party negotiations, President Biden's landmark infrastructure spending package passed through the House of Representatives with bipartisan support earlier in November. The once-in-a-lifetime spending measure passed with 228 votes in favor of the legislation and 206 votes against it. Hailing the accomplishment as a monumental step forward, President Biden declared finally Infrastructure Week. On November 15th, President Joe Biden signed the bipartisan infrastructure package into law at the White House. As the most significant investment in the United States infrastructure in a generation, the passage of this legislation could only be understood as a major domestic policy victory for President Biden and a once-in-a-generation investment in the United States. Next on the docket would be the broader and more ambitious Build Back Better package, which was originally priced at $3.5 trillion and was slated to pass into law via budget reconciliation. The price tag and programs of the Build Back Better Act were renegotiated to satisfy the objections of Senators Manchin and Sinema, both Democrats. Now the cost of Build Back Better had come down from $3.5 trillion to $1.75 trillion. Left outside would be paid family leave. Left in would be $400 billion for universal pre-K and subsidized childcare, $200 billion for the child tax credit, $130 billion to extend ACA COVID subsidies and for Medicaid, and $555 billion for clean energy technologies. That legislation would have to pass through both chambers of Congress. Ahead of the vote in the two chambers of Congress were the ratings agency's assessments of the effects of the Build Back Better Act, as well as the prospective scoring of the domestic investment by the Congressional Budget Office, also known as the CBO. As it turned out, key ratings agencies, including Moody's and Fitch, concluded that the legislation did not add to inflationary pressures in the short term and in fact decreased inflationary pressures in the longer term. Adding to the good news for the president's agenda was the highly anticipated CBO score. In its report, the CBO made the following declaration. This is a quote. CBO estimates that the funding for tax enforcement activities provided by H.R. 5376, the Build Back Better Act, would increase outlays by $80 billion, and revenues by $207 billion, that's $207 billion, thus decreasing the deficit by $127 billion through 2031. That is the end of the quote. The CBO also clarified that it made its assumptions on the basis of IRS tax enforcement. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi originally scheduled the vote for November 18th, but with House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy taking to the floor of the House for 8.5 hours in an effort to derail the bill, the vote was rescheduled for the next morning. That vote occurred on November 19th, 2021, with the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives voting to pass Biden's Build Back Better Act, H.R. 5376, into law. It would thus be dispatched to the Senate for passage via budget reconciliation. Now on to some other stories unfolding in the world as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to threaten. Across Europe, COVID-19 was spiking again, causing several countries to take draconian steps against the unvaccinated to prevent transmission of the lethal virus and the evolution of variants. The European Union Health Commissioner Stella Kyriakides explained that the spike in COVID cases was fueled by vaccine hesitancy and making the effort to get people vaccinated worse. That being said, breakthrough infections and deaths were less likely to occur among the vaccinated. Kyriakides warned Europe was now facing a pandemic mainly driven by the unvaccinated and that a hard stand was necessitated. By the third week of November 2021, mass demonstrations and riots were ensuing in response to the measures undertaken by governments to mitigate the spread of the lethal virus. From Croatia to Austria to the Netherlands to Belgium to Italy, protests were unfolding against the tough pandemic protocols, particularly targeting the unvaccinated. In response to riots in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte called for calm and referred to those inciting violence as, and I quote, idiots. Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo issued a similar message in his country, saying, "Our goal today is to fight against the virus. Please let us not get incited by a small group which would turn it into a fight against one another." That is the end of his quote. Other things I've covered in this week's political intelligence briefing included Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega being banned from the United States in response to sham elections in that country. Moving south, the first round of the presidential elections were held in Chile, with results defying expectations. The conventional wisdom had been that the center-right and center-left candidates, Sichel and Provost, respectively, would be the most electable. Instead, it was the far-right, hard far-right candidate, Jose Antonio Cast, and the progressive leftist candidate, Gabriel Boric, who would be headed to the second round in December. The election had already been a polarizing one, and the runoff promised to further agitate deep social and political tensions in Chile. On the one hand was Cast, a hard, right-wing authoritarian candidate whose brother had been a stalwart of Augusto Pinochet and who had expressly campaigned on his defense of the regime of the former Chilean dictator. On the other hand was Boric, a student activist leader who rose to prominence as a protest leader, arguing for higher quality education, and who was elected to Congress in 2014. It was unclear how the voting would transpire in the second round. To whom would the supporters of the candidates who did not make it to the second round migrate? Should Cast manage to win the presidency in the second round, he would have a tough road ahead in advancing his agenda, as his bloc won only 15 seats in parliamentary elections to the lower house. Finally, following elections in Germany, coalition talks between the Social Democrats, Greens and FDP were coming to a successful close. A traffic light coalition between the three parties would likely be in place by mid-December, and Olaf Scholz was on track to succeed Angela Merkel as Chancellor. Next week, I'll cover China's investment interest in Djibouti, US-Sino relations with regard to Taiwan, the status of the Iran JCPOA talks, the buildup of Russian troops on the border with Ukraine, and the landscape in the Horn of Africa, specifically with regard to Sudan after the coup d'etat and the ongoing state of emergency in Ethiopia. I'd like to take this time to mention my comprehensive Afghanistan withdrawal report called Sunsets in the Graveyard of Empires will soon be available for purchase from the Country Watch website at www.countrywatch.com. On this day that I'm recording this, it is Thanksgiving in the United States. I'd like to thank you for your time. I'd want you to have a good day and remember that now more than ever, we live in an interconnected world.